Yo, what up legends? Thanks for tuning into the video. As you can see from the title, what I'm going to be doing is breaking down my remix of Cold Heart by Elton John and Lipa. Fun fact about this song actually is that Elton John didn't actually have to go into the studio to record any of these vocals, as all of the vocal stems are taken from 4 of his previously released tracks. So he's laughing all the way to the bank and didn't actually have to do anything with it except maybe preview it a few times, which is awesome. Gotta love him, and he does an amazing job on all of his tracks. Alright, let's start from the top. I always start with my kick, and you'll hear me say this in every single one of my videos. The limiter, I always try to set it to -8 dBs and chuck a limiter on it, as we can hear here. Nothing too hectic going on. I'm just chopping off the top of that frequency. You want to look for about, between 1 and 3 dBs gain reduction on that. It'll just help your kick pump a little bit harder. That, and I set it to -8 because it creates a good reference point for the rest of the song. So I set my kick to -8 dBs with a limiter, then you know it's only hitting a max of -8 dBs, and then you can kind of build the rest of the mix around that. If it does get too loud on the master chain when you go to mastering, obviously you can just drop the whole mix down, make it below say -6 dBs, and then master it back up from there. A few cool plugins that I like to use on my kicks. This one in particular is Kashmir's Essential Kick. It's a free plugin. I highly recommend to go and download it because it'll help you kind of just shape the kick into how you hear it in your mind or how it suits the mix and what's going on with the track. You've got all these different parameters here which you can play around with and see what suits you best. I generally end up boosting a little bit of the sub, mids, leave it alone, a bit of the transient if you want that top end to pop through a little bit more, and the pressure knob is actually pretty cool. But I think the main thing with all of these parameters is not to go too hard on them. I generally don't go above maybe 30-40% with most of them. Mids at 100 because that's where it always sits. That just means it's true to the original sample. So yeah, a little bit of EQ. I've got the bass mono here. Under 200 Hz will be on the mono and kick. This helps adds a little bit of, or keeps the width in the mid and high frequencies that are in the kick, whilst making the bass and the sub frequencies in mono, which you kind of want for all of your bass elements. Basic EQ here, just dipping out a bit of 1K through Kashmir's Essential Kick and then into the limiter, and then onto the bass line. Let's check it out. Yeah, really vibing that bass line. I think to get this bass line, I do this with all of my remixes, but you can look it up online and try to find if you can get MIDI clips which are written for the original track. You then take those MIDI clips and kind of turn it into something yourself. So the melody that I have here for the bass line is very similar to the original track, except I've just changed the timing of some notes, put a few extra notes in just to give it a bit more movement, a bit more energy, because as you know, the Panau remix of the Cold Heart is relatively chilled, and giving it that Oscar Jamo style, it's gonna need energy and it's gonna need a fucking slap hard in those clubs. So yeah, in terms of processing, not a whole lot going on here. On the main channel, I've got a little bit of EQ. I'm not going to show you that because then I'll have to unfreeze and refreeze this track, which just becomes annoying. So we'll just stick to the subgroup stuff here. So this is a really cool plug, and I find that it helps tighten your low end frequencies. I've got a few cool presets in here, or my Ableton's just decided to stop loading them, but I think there's one called Tighter Low End and Pop Punch, which I generally use for a lot of my tracks. I highly recommend the Ozone 9 plugins. You get a whole different bunch of limiters, maximizers, exciters, images, low end focus, all these different things which you can either use as the chain through Ozone 9, which I do for my mastering, or you can use those individual effects on individual channels as well. So for the EQing here, I've just cut out a bit of those top frequencies because I felt like it was clashing with a few other things I had going on, and I also felt like the mids and high mids needed to pump through in the mix a bit more to kind of balance it out with the sub that's in this, but nothing too special there. Through a limiter, cool settings on this one. The Pro L2 goes hard, and there's some presets here which I generally use. The bass limiter 1, limiter 2, which I generally use on my sub basses or my basses. Just tightens things up, and I find that it helps you make it sit nicer in the mix. So I'll play the kick and the bass together. As you can see here, I've actually grouped them together because I felt like there was a bit too much sub, and I've done a little bit of EQ here, which I will show you what it's doing by playing them together. So as you can see, it's kind of side chaining that low end, and I decided to I don't do this with all my tracks, but I decided to process these together so you can get that kick and bass relationship right, which is the fundamental for almost any house track. You know, if the kick and the bass line are working well together, then you've got a good foundation to build the other track or the rest of the track around it. So let's move on from the kick and the bass. The clap. So as you can probably tell here, I had a bit of a hard time trying to get this clap right, so I've used 4 different clap samples and laid them over each other. Something I haven't done, which I generally would do if I'm using this many clap samples over the top of each other, is a bit of panning to give it width and make it easier to hear within the stereo spectrum, and so that it's not battling with all these other sounds that sit in the center of your mix. So, or your things that are in mono, or the things that just sit in the center, they won't be clashing. And when it comes to listening to it on a big system or referencing on headphones, it'll just be a bit more clearer, and as I said, it won't be battling with anything else for that kind of space. You've got to think about your mix downs as kind of as a cube. You have left and right, you've got center, and then you've got the background as well. So things like effects, sweeps, rises generally will sit in the background. Any little bits of ear candy that you have or percussion will sit in the background a bit, and then you've also got to think about the stereo spectrum, the left and the right, and what sits in the middle. Usually you've got your kick and your bass in the middle, the hi-hats and your drums are usually at the front, to the sides a little bit, and I think that's just a really good method to go of thinking about your mixes and how the mix down is going to sound good and where everything needs to sit so that they all have their own space. Let's listen to this clap. Nice. Nice and tasty, that clap. It's got a lot of high end to it, which I really like. I think it helps cut through in the mix here. This is something that I like to do with most of my subgroups, is a little bit of compression. Nothing too intense though. And when you're doing compression, another good unit to use, this is a great one. I think it's pretty cheap, like 40 or 50 bucks. But I think the glue compressor from Ableton's stock plugins is a very good compressor for doing this kind of stuff. I'll play this in a sec with all the plugins up, but generally you don't want to go too hard on this compression. Again, like the same thing I do with my limiters, is you just want it clipping the top of the waveform there just to tighten everything up a little bit. For your settings, attack doesn't matter too much. You generally want it, I guess, between 3 and 30 on this one. You don't want it too low. But the release, you want it as low as possible there, and you kind of just roll back the threshold until you see about 1 to 2 dBs of gain reduction. Nice. This is also a really cool channel strip plugin. I use it because I actually got recommended it by my good mate Josh Yenkin, absolute legend, an amazing producer. It has a really nice tonality of sound. It kind of replicates the hardware unit's timbre that, you know, a lot of people kind of don't really think about too much. I feel like it adds a really nice warmth to the sounds, and I kind of just use it for EQing. So you can see here I've kind of boosted the high mid frequencies, the high frequencies, and a little bit of the low mid frequencies as well, and then you can kind of set where the bell point is on the frequency spectrum here. So I've got this one sitting about 3.9 kilohertz. Other ones haven't fucked with too much. And then from there, routed into the limiter, and you got to think about signal flow here. You got the compression, tightening up a little bit, got a little bit of EQ here, making it sound nice and warm, and then you've got the limiter last on your chain there to squash it all together. Let's move on to the snare. Sorry about that, bit of a hiccup. Snare, not too much going on here, just a simple snare roll from the Volux sample pack. Fucking great sample pack, highly recommended if you're making tech house, bass house, anything house wise. Love it, use it all the time. Yeah, it's just a snare roll, and then I've got the limiter here. Obviously, same thing, just taking down the peaks of these waveforms by 1 to 2 or 3 dBs gain reduction. On to the next. The drums, the hats. What do we got here? Let's have a listen. So, listening back to that, I actually have made a mistake here. I don't know if anybody else noticed it, but I'll play it back again. There is a bit of a click at the end of this. I assume it's this sample here, because I haven't rolled off or faded the edges of the clips. I'll play it back now and see if you can hear the click. So when you play it with the whole mix, you can't really hear it. It's not standing out too much. Sometimes that click can kind of add to the rhythm of what you've got playing, but generally, I would, for 99% of my tracks, clearly not this one, is fade out the edge of these clips here. You've got a key command of A, which you then can see the fades. I've got this frozen right now, so you can't really see it, but you can see on this bottom one how I faded it. A is a quick key command to go between the clip view and the automation view. But yeah, that's something you should do. Fade all your clip edges so you don't have those clicking in there. Alright, let's break it down a bit. So we've got the evolution of sound loop here. Again, more open hats. Then we've got a supplementary hat. So this is something I'll use in a lot of my tracks. It's just a one-off hit at the end of every 2, 4, 8, however many bars. So it adds to the groove. So I'll play it all together. It just adds a bit of variation to the last hit, and putting it on the last kind of hit of the bar will help it give a little bit of swing, a little bit of variation before it moves into the next section as well. That's something that you can do with your hi-hats or your percussion just to keep things interesting. Then we got crashes, nothing special going on here. Let's look at the processing on these. Not much, just a bit of EQing. Make sure you cut out all your low end on stuff that doesn't need it there. Let's zoom out. And then fills. Philip, good old Philly boy. Ooh, I love that. Dave Winnell sample pack. 789. Really good sample pack. It's got some awesome fills in it. It's got some really big toms and snare hits, which I like to use in my tracks. And what I've done here is I've actually joined them together. Generally, I would process these together if they need it. I didn't feel like these sounds needed it at all. So what I've done is I've just got these 2 separate samples here. The top one sounds like this. And then the bottom, oh, that was both together, sorry. I don't know why that's not letting me do that. Here we go. Pretty cool. And then I've just got a massive snare reverb here, which I like to use before drops or at the end of fills as well. Real cool. And then another fill over here. Sounds like I've pitched it down a little bit as well. When you go into here, envelopes. Okay, maybe that's built into the track. Or maybe what I've done is I've pitched it down using the clip transposition, you can change the key of the semitones. I think I've done that and then resampled it into the one sample. Nice. And then for the rest of the perk is shakers. Now, shakers are very cool things to use in this. They can kind of supplement out the closed hats if you're looking for a bit of groove, a bit of rhythm to them. But to get them right and make them not seem stagnant, there is a fair bit of stuff you can do to do this. So as you can see from here, I've got a MIDI rack with all of my shaker sounds. So what I generally do is I'll save these MIDIs. I've got my MIDI clips up here. I can go through and save my MIDI clips. So then I can drag and drop, and then you've got a good basis to go off. But what I'll do is I'll use two different hits. I'll use two different hits here and here, as you can see. That helps add to the groove. Also on top of that is your velocity. You want to change your velocities down here to keep it interesting the whole way through. This is something that a lot of top producers do when they're working with the percussion side of things. It just, as I said, gives it variation and keeps things interesting. And then it comes down to the processing. So I felt like these were a bit stagnant and sat a little bit too much in the middle. So simple EQ here, just cutting out a little bit the high frequencies and a lot of the low end because we don't need that in the mix. And then this EQ here, I've actually put it into left-right mode, as you can see here, and then boosted the left and right signals in different frequency spectrums. That'll help just widen up these. As you can see, I don't have any panning on it, but when you use this left-right EQ here, it pushes certain frequencies to either side, so you don't have frequencies that are clashing, and it creates more space in the mix, and makes it more audible, and makes it sound crisper and cleaner. And I really like the way that they sound in this. On top of that, sidechain. I've got the LFO tool here. I've gone pretty ham on this one here because I wanted to add to that groove, and as you can see, you've got your 4 hits here. So picture these 4 bits of waveform as these 4 hits here. I've got it jumping up on the 3rd hit, which is where I have my second shaker popping in. So I'll have a listen now, and you can kind of hear the groove that it gives it by not having it as the exact same sample the whole way through, and with the LFO chopping it in and out. You can hear on that offbeat that it really pumps through, and that's something that, you know, I'll generally turn these up really loud when I'm doing this stuff, when I'm doing the processing, getting it sitting right in the mix, and then lower it into the background once I feel like it's got a good groove, or it works at a loud volume, push it into the background so that it fits with everything else that's going on. But generally you want your closed and your open hats sitting at the front of the mix compared to the shakers. Now all together, let's hear them. Dope, how cool, loving that. One thing I didn't run you through is just the automation on this bass. I'm probably going to skip over it because, maybe we can have a look here. Yeah, so I've got a bit of automation going on here. Let's open up these lanes. Release, serum, attack, serum, sustain. So you might have heard attack, release, sustain before. That comes down to your envelopes, which is ADSR, attack, decay, sustain, release. Once you know how these work, you will be able to utilize it to make your sound so much more interesting. It's a sound design concept, and as you can see here, you can either use it a lot to keep it interesting the whole way through, or in little parts throughout the track, just to say, I've used this exact same rhythm for my bass line the whole way through, but it doesn't feel the same the whole way through because I've got all these automations going on, keeping it interesting. Even small things like here, which I think it kind of turns it into a longer attack in the sense that it kind of fades in a little bit. Let's have a listen. See? How cool. Exact same sound as that plucky bass line that I've been using. And then cutoff, where is that? Cutoff is here. You can see that I've got it going up at the end of every 4 bars. It just gives and energy building to the end of the bar, and helps it transition into the next sections as well. Sweet. Alright, so that's our drums, our snare, our clap, our kick, and our bass. The foundations of every fucking house track. You get those right, then you move on to the next. So, what have we got here for leads? Let's have a listen. Fuck, I love that sound. So nice. So, again, automations on it. Small automations, long automations the whole way through the track, just to keep it changing, keep it interesting. I highly recommend playing around with it. Don't go too hard on it. It's something that you want to do slow changes with, just to give a bit of variation throughout the track. And again, I've used the exact same rhythm the whole way through, but these automations keep it interesting and makes the track stay interesting the whole way through, rather than being stagnant and boring, which I feel is something that takes you from an amateur or intermediate producer into a professional, an advanced producer, where you can have this one rhythm on this one sound playing throughout 4.5 minutes of a track, but it stays interesting the whole way through. Sick, really nice sounds there. So I've got this second layer as well. I've labeled it as wide, so I don't know if I can open up Serum. That's the main layer. That's the wide layer. See if I can open up Serum. I can't because it's frozen. But I think what I've done with this to make it the wide layer is use your detune. So you can turn the detune up, and you don't want to go too hard with it. Usually I sit at around 40 or 50% on the detune, and that'll just widen up that layer. I've also done a bit of different EQing and put different effects on it inside the Serum, because you don't want the exact same sound playing over the top of each other, because that will create phasing issues, which is a pretty advanced thing to be able to hear or notice in your mixes. I highly recommend doing some research into it, and you can use plugins to actually help identify this kind of stuff. One free one's called the Corellometer, which is by Voxengo, if I'm not mistaken. Anyways, it's a great plugin. It'll tell you whereabouts on the frequency spectrum that it is phasing, or if there's any phase issues, and then you can kind of go and address them with some mid-side EQ, changing a sound, you know, if there's layers, changing one of those sounds, spreading it out a little bit. There's a bunch of different things you can do, and I just think you should play around until you find what works for your track or your style of production. So that's the main lead. I'll play that in a sec over the top of everything else, but I also wanted to show you a few other things I've got going on in here. So a saw lead. Woo! Yeah, sick. Again, that's just doing the exact same thing as the lead up here is. I think that I put it in there just to give it a bit more grit and a bit more energy leading up to the drops. As you can see, I've hardly used it here in the first drop. Come down to the second breakdown and third breakdown, that's when I reintroduce it, just to make it interesting. Keeps coming back to making it interesting, and you know, giving a bit of variety to the track, a bit more energy as it builds up. As with all the other ones, got a bit of automation going on here. Usually just rising up to when it drops, because that's your drop, that's your drop. And here, what have I got doing here? So that is a little part where I guess you could call it a fill in a way, but as it drops, it's just the bass and the kick. And this adds a little bit more element, which to me this is what adds a bit of flow to the transition between it just being the kick and the bass from the drop into me dropping in the hats and the drums here. Cool, all works together. I don't know what's happening there. Let's go into these synth LFOs that I use at the drop. So I've got two playing here. I just think what I've done is separate the low and the high octave just to make it sound a bit more aggressive. I would go more into depth about how you get the sound to move like that using LFOs inside Serum, but as I said, then I'd have to unfreeze these tracks and then delve into Serum and show you how that works. So maybe that's a video for another time, or if you've got any questions about that kind of stuff, feel free to reach out and I might make you an individual video or just write out how it works. I also thought from that synth at the drop there that it kind of needed to be extended a bit. I didn't want it to be extending at the LFO rate, so what I've done here is I resampled the synths here at the drop and turned it into a stab. As you can hear, the stab's moving around a lot in the stereo spectrum. It's going left and right and around, which is something that I find is fucking awesome for, you know, adding a bit of interest to your tracks. The Endless Smile should probably been up here, but you can use the stock plugin for Ableton, AutoPan here. I got it at rate of 1.4. You can play around with the amounts and the shape. The shape will kind of, hard to explain, but it will determine how much time it spends going from one side to the other. So I've turned the shape up a fair bit, as you can see from this kind of waveform thing here. I've turned it up so that it jumps from left to right really quickly, so that the sound doesn't spend too much time in the middle of the mix where I've got a lot of other stuff going on. It just helps create space and make the thing interesting as well. What else have we got going on in here? We've got laser and then ARP. I really like this ARP. We'll go to laser first. Just a bit of ear candy. Chuck it in here and there. Probably put a side chain on it. Cut out those low frequencies, and I've got a little bit of gain automation here on your utility. I do this rather than using the volume automation, because if you want to change the level in your mix, you can do that easy. I can go up and down and change the volume right here. If you'd use your volume automation, you can't do that as easily. You'd then have to put a utility on and drop it down, or delete the automation, bring it down and re-add in the automation that you've done on the volume of the channel. So yep, use utilities and just automate the gain instead. Onto the ARP. The uppy up. Love it. I was so happy when I came across this because it fit well with everything else that's going on. As you can see, it plays throughout pretty much the entire song. Then I use just frequency and cut off automation here to kind of reintroduce it, chuck it back into the background where there's too many things going on. But as a whole, I think it fills up space that needed filling with the track. It sits in the background, it sits more to the left and the right rather than clogging up the center of the mix. As I keep coming back to, you do not want to clog up the center of the mix. You want it sounding wide and you want it sounding interesting, so rather than then just panning it to one side, although I have given it a little bit of panning here, I've got the auto pan on it at a very low rate and low amount here just to give it a bit of movement. Let's have a listen so you can hear it going left to right. Mix tips, that's a great one. Auto pan is fucking awesome. Using your panning it'll make your mixes just sound so much cleaner. Highly recommend doing it with all of those elements, as I said, that don't sit at the front and center of the mix. Cool. Processing. Not too much going on. I've chucked an arpeggiator on it to give it that sound. I've used Diva, which is a fucking awesome synth. It's got a really nice, warm kind of hardware sound to it. I've got an imager on here. Imager just, again, gives it a bit more stereo width. Low pass, we all know what that does. Auto pan, and then a side chain on it. So let's play everything that I've gone through already. We'll play the synths, the drums, the claps, the snare, the kick, and the bass, and we'll do it from leading up to the second drop. Awesome, sounding really good together. Actually, I'll go through the bus processing as I do on the other ones. A little bit of compression, Endless Smile. It's an awesome plug. I use that just to kind of automate up it. Build ups. What it'll do is add a little bit of filtering to it, a little bit of reverb, a little bit of delay, just to kind of give it that rising feeling. And as you can see here, I've kind of done a little bit on the first drop, picked it up a bit more at the second drop, and then for the third drop, gone full ham right to the very end. In this gap here is generally where I'll have a vocal or something pop in just before the drop, as you'll see a lot of producers do, where I've got 2 bars there between the end of the build-up and the drop. So I kind of wanted to cut it out a little bit as the vocal popped through. With this one, I want it rising right up to the drop, so then it kicks in as soon as it drops there. And my favorite, Soothe. This will just reduce resonant frequencies. It's a resonance suppressor. It's quite expensive, but it speeds things up big time. It stops you from having to go through and notch things out individually. Then you have to use something like Span or a spectrum analyzer to see where there are resonant frequencies and then go and notch them out, set the right levels. So this just speeds that up big time. I highly recommend using it if you're doing your own mix downs or mastering for that sense. I use it on my master chain every single time. Alright, cool, that's the bulk of it really. Then we're on to the effects. Just a bunch of risers, downlifters, sweeps. Not a whole lot of processing on these ones either. So you can see here down the bottom, I'm going through different channels, so cut out a lot of those high frequencies because I find it can get a little harsh, and a lot of the low frequencies because we just don't need it there. It'll muddy up your mix. And some of them have a side chain on it, but that's about it. But on the subgroup, again, a little bit of compression, 1 to 2 dBs gain reduction. The Ozone Imager, this is something that I will put on all of my effects subgroups, given that they're elements that sit in the background. You don't want them sitting too much in the middle, so this just helps put it up in the put it side to side in the stereo spectrum, gives other elements space, especially if you've got like your drums and other sounds that use a lot of the high mid and high frequencies there. So do these effects, or your sweeps, your white noise, that kind of stuff. So I tried to separate them from each other by giving the effects a bit of width, putting them into the background there, and then you have your drums coming through, not completely in the center, but usually between, 15 left to 15 right. Gives a little space for the kick, the clap, the snare that are sitting in the middle as well. But then the effects would be even wider than that on the stereo spectrum. Now onto the Vox, the vocals. Look it up online. Try to find a really good a cappella for your remixes. Generally, you'll be able to find them. And look, it took me ages to warp this into time. We got there eventually. So there's actually a fair bit happening on this. Did I use the vocal processing chain on this? I didn't. That simplifies it a little bit. We'll go through the normal Vox. Sounds awesome.
Think it's gonna be a long, long time till touchdown brings me round again to fight. I'm not the
So not much happening at all on this one. I just, as I said, warped it into time. You've got the utility here with a little bit of gain automation. But the second one is the second layer is something I like to do with a lot of my vocals, especially if you're doing a remix or something like that. You don't actually want it sounding identical to how it was in the first one. So what I've done here is just chucked a little Alter Boy on it. I might unfreeze this track so we can have a look at Little Alter Boy.
Brings me round again to fight. I'm not the man I think I am at home. Oh no, no, no. And this is what I should.
And together.
Be a long, long time till touchdown brings me round again to fight. I'm not the man I think I am at home.
Just gives it a bit of depth. I really like how the formants work on this one. So the formants are actually a hard one to explain. It kind of sounds like it's repitching it, but in reality it's not. It's keeping it in the same key whilst changing the timbre and the tonality of the vocal. So I know I say don't use the same samples over the top of each other, but in this instance, because I've changed the format on them, they work together and there is no phasing issues. I've actually checked that with a correllometer, which I can load up for you right now as well. Actually, let's have a look at it. Correllometer, here you are. So this will show you whether it's phasing or not. Well, geez, there is a little bit of phasing there. Not overly noticeable. You kind of generally want this staying on the positive side of things. I could have gone through and used some mid-side EQ and kind of boosted the separate sections or reduced separate sections in those areas so that they don't clash as much and create phasing issues. You can actually hear it a little bit if you're listening, where it kind of sounds like it's cutting in and out a little bit. That's because the phasing issues come from waveforms playing at exact opposites, which means they cancel each other out. It's not overly noticeable, but that is something that I probably should have addressed. Considering I wrote this probably a few months ago now, I definitely would have addressed that if I had written it in the past couple of weeks. And on to the resample, something I do with a lot of my tracks, helps fill space, but I get one of the reverbs that I've been using on my sends down here, generally the longest one possible. I pump up the dry wet very high, 90, 100%, and I'll chop out the first part of the track. So I'll chop out something like this part of the vocal, drag it onto a new clip, and then reverse it, chuck on this reverb, and then freeze and flatten it. Freeze flatten. That will give you the start of this vocal in reverse with a tail. So then if I take that tail and reverse the tail, it then becomes the same note leading up to it. So we'll listen to this one here. It's kind of just like making sweeps out of your vocals, and I don't know if you could hear it from listening to this sample, but you can kind of hear a little bit of that vocal popping through on top of all the reverb and other effects that are going on. This is an awesome technique to fill space and chuck into transitions. I've used it a lot in this track. Generally, I don't use it this much in my tracks, but hey, it must have fit, and when I was writing it at the time, there's one golden rule to audio, and that's if it sounds good, it fucking sounds good. Stick with your ears, trust your ears, but also train your ears to know what sounds right. And then the last bit of the track. Can't remember exactly how I've done this, but I've chopped it up. I've got a little Alter Boy on it. I've chopped it up, and I think I probably would have put a little bit of swing on it as well. Yeah, I've got a little bit of swing on this track as well. Basically just turns it into an ARP. if I was thinking right, I would have put, oh, I didn't, but some auto pan on something like that as well, just to move it around in the stereo spectrum. Alright, let's have another listen to the whole thing. There you have it, guys. I think that's mostly it. You know what? Fuck it. I will run you through the mastering chain as well. So here are 3 great plugins for monitoring. I'm going to turn the mastering chain off and show you what it's like pre-master. Mix is still pretty decent. So with these monitoring plugins, they will kind of give you an idea of what needs to happen with the track. You've got tonal balance control too, which is great. I think it's by Isotope as well, who do the Ozone 9. Basically, you can set your different curves to the genre that you're making, and if this white line goes outside of these 2 blue lines, generally it might be something that you want to address. So say if the bass is peaking up here too much, you want to reduce your bass by using some EQ so you don't change the volume of the track too much, so you can keep it at the same mix level. But that's something that's a good reference point. Sometimes I'll find that my high frequencies are a bit too high, or the low frequencies are a bit too low, or there's just nothing going on in the mids, and then you kind of address those things in the mix before coming back to doing your mastering. Then you've got this as well, the span. You can use this as a visual aspect to see if there's any resonant frequencies in there. So that's something I will do before I finish any master, is run the full track through span and have a look if there's anything that's poking out too much. It's also a good reference for your loudness, but we'll use this last plugin for that as well. So yeah, you can find resonant frequencies. You've got the correlator down here as well, which will help with phasing, analyzing phasing and showing you if there's any phasing. You want this positive and you want it as up high as possible, really. And then Ulean, this will just show you the loudness of the track. So they say that negative 14 dB or negative 14 LUFS is the industry standard. If you've ever had a track louder, mastered louder than that, and you put it up on Spotify, Spotify will automatically take it down to negative 14 LUFS. I will generally master to about negative 8 LUFS with the electronic music. It depends on the vibe of the tracks. If you're making a rock band, you don't need it as loud and as squash as you do with the electronic music, but you want it kind of at the same loudness. If you're mixing 2 tracks together, you want them at a near same loudness. So I go to negative 8. Sometimes I push it up higher than that. Say if it's a dubstep track or something, I might go to negative 6. But I guess it all just depends on what you're going for with your track. And it's dawned on me over the past 6 months that it's very subjective where you want to go with your mixes and your master. It's not an equation. It's not 2 and 2 equals 4. It's down to personal preference and the mastering engineer or mix engineer's preference as well. So you just got to think and use your head about what outcome you want when you're going through these rounds. Alright, so that's all there. Let's go into the mastering chain itself. We'll chuck it back on. Let's have a listen. Ooh. Yep, now the latency's bugging out because I've got so many plugins going on and because I probably unfroze a few of these. Anyways, so not everybody uses compression on their mastering. I like the sound of this bus compressor. It's not a master compressor, but I like the sound of it. And if you are compressing your master, don't go too hard on it. You'll see here there's probably absolute max 2 dBs gain reduction, but you really just want it clipping the top of that waveform. I usually go for 1 to 2 dBs gain reduction, and that'll just squash it down a little bit. I then run it into EQ. Again, I've done a bit here. So for me to come up with this, I've used span and seen what span's showing me in terms of loudness of the frequency spectrum. Notice that it's needed a bit more in the low mids and in the low end itself, so I've jacked that up as a last measure rather than doing it in the mix, which is probably a better idea. I've used a bit of EQ to do it on my master here because I'm on a deadline with releasing these remixes, and I want to get things done as fast as possible, and workflow is a massive thing. The faster your workflow, the better you'll be able to work, the more you'll be able to get done when you're in the creative zone, which for me is hard to get to sometimes. Alright, so through the EQ into an exciter, got a little bit of boost on the high frequencies and the mid frequencies here. Not too much going on. Imager as well, giving a bit of space to the high frequencies and the mid frequencies as well, just pushing it left and right. And then into the maximizer. So this one's cool. It's not actually showing it right now, which is odd, but you can kind of set, there's a threshold down here which usually pops up. You can set it to -8, -10, -12 LUFS, and then hit the automatic button, and it'll take it to that loudness level. It's not always 100% true, because then you run it through other stuff, and by the time that it gets to say Ulean here, it might be showing it louder or softer, and then you just adjust the threshold until you get it right at that loudness that you want. So from my maximizer into this saturation plugin, you can play around with the settings if you like. I find that the Master Bus Sheen and the Master Massive work great. Master Bus Sheen works better for tracks that are a bit more vibey, a bit more vocally. The Master Massive works good for my tech house, bass house, thick, kind of heavy, dirty club stuff. Pretty simple there. This is a great preset, balanced to the Grammy Awards. I use it on all of my master chains here. You don't want to go too hard with this. You see I've got the depth sitting down here at -7.4, so it's actually not clipping up too much of the track. I'll show you, hopefully the latency isn't too bad. So you can see at max there, it's reducing some of those peaks by up to 1 dB. You don't want anything too much more than that, because it might destroy the tonality of your mix down. And then into the limiter. And that is always the last thing I use on my master chain, is the limiter. Again, you're looking for between 1 to 3 dBs gain reduction, or even less than that if that's what you're looking for. Obviously certain genres are squashed more than others. If you're doing a dubstep track, you can probably push the limiter a little bit harder than, say, if you're doing an indie rock track, which it just doesn't need to be as squished. And then from there, you run it through all of that. And then into your monitoring plugins, which this should show around -7, -8 LUFS. Let's have a look. Excuse the cutting in and out. There's just so many plugins going on in here. But I think that mainly covers most of the track. I hope this has been insightful for you guys. Look, feel free to reach out over socials or on YouTube if you've got any questions. If you've enjoyed the track, hit that subscribe button, and there'll be plenty more videos like this in the future, detailing little bits and bobs that I do on my tracks. But as always, cheers for the support, guys, and I hope this has been helpful. Have a good one.